Chapter 3: Foul Sorcery.
On another world, a man stood on the roof of a lighthouse. The wind and the rain whipped about his large, multicoloured robe, causing it to flutter and flap like bed sheets put out to dry on a blustery day. Far away, midway between the horizon and the mound of rock on which the lighthouse sat, was a ship, its mast, aft and stern lights were the only visible points against the black of the night. The moon was full, yet the sky was choked with low, brooding cloud, and so the coast and the choppy sea were overrun with vast, dark and fleeting shadows. It was a devilish night. It was a night fit for skullduggery. The sorcerer, his arms outstretched, rolled and reeled his head. He was laughing like a maniac. His teeth, white against the dark of the night, seemed as large and as prominent as the score of rocks that pierced the sea between the lighthouse and the distant ship. This ship was laden with foodstuffs, spices, gold and precious stones. The night crew maintained their coast-hugging course. They kept themselves busy by bagpiping the mizens, bracing the yards, clapping a service in the horse, and surging the capstan. The majority of the crew slept peacefully in hammocks in the bowels of the ship. Below the lighthouse, within the supporting granite spit, were crevices and caverns. Most of these had been formed by the action of the tide and other natural forces, but some had been fashioned more recently. Supernatural forces had extended and added to what nature had already created, to form catacombs large enough to hide a small army. The sorcerer clapped his hands once above his head, and the sound of 1,000 screams rose up to replace the shrill whistle of the wind. Below the lighthouse, where the sea licked away at the base of the mound, the water started to churn and froth. Creatures with great jointed limbs broke the surface briefly, only to disappear and head out to sea. They were moving straight for the ship. No one on board saw the vast single shadow of the approaching army until it was too late. The ship fetched away at first, rolling portside as a mass of enormous crabs scuttled and clambered up over the sides. Some sailors stirred in their sleep, disturbed by the sound of scratching and scraping against wood, but most continued dreaming of finer places, finer food, and fine female company. When the first of the crabs had reached the bulwark, these intruders, whose bodies were bloated, twisted and transformed by foul witchcraft, were spotted by a sole sailor who had leant over to the side to see what had caused the ship to reel. He mumbled, stumbled and yelled, "All hands away!" These were his last words. The unfortunate fellow was quickly plucked, dismembered, and his remains trampled over as his fearsome, crustaceous onslaught swarmed over the deck of the ship. The rest of the crew were overwhelmed just as easily. A few threw themselves over starboard and into the sea. A few let down the hatches and tried to close them, but the crabs were too quick and too strong, and they immediately forced their way down below. All was carnage. Most of the crew died before they were truly awake. The whole port side of the ship was now crawling and writhing with crabs, and the ship was finally pulled so far over that the sea swept over and into her belly. She sunk in seconds. The ship dropped to the bottom of the sea, and the crabs continued biting and carving their way through each deck, grabbing anything and everything stashed in chests, barrels and boxes. And as the ship was a pirate raider, she had much booty stashed in her hold. When the grim ransack of the ship was fully complete, and the treasures brought back and deposited in catacombs under the lighthouse, the crabs heard the call of their master and returned to the wreck to feast. This was their reward. They had become accustomed to the taste of pirate flesh over the last few months. From the start to the finish, from the summoning to the release, the sorcerer had been drunk and dizzy with an eldritch power that sought to contaminate and control his otherwise orderly mind. He eventually called a halt to his malevolent spell, and he slumped to the floor, trembling from more than just the cold. After 5 minutes of lying atop the lighthouse, curled into a ball, he struggled to his feet, and then stumbled and staggered over to the trapdoor that led down inside. He wrenched it open, and half climbed, half fell, down the steps within.
Chapter 4: A Relic of Lost Civilization.
Vermin, a creature that revels in filth, a creature of no worth. Yet this creature is the start of a journey, from boy to man, from Famulus to Magus, from innocence to corruption. So the journey of the sorcerer starts. The puppet master in this tower awaits his puppet.
7 years earlier. High atop a hill, in the middle of the sprawling city of Yardsell-on-the-Mean, sits a very large and very ancient stone machine. This machine turned, thumped, grated and pounded. It had done so for over 600 years, for that is the age of the city. Yet, if truth were known, this machine celebrated its 8,432nd birthday this year. Only a select few knew this fact, and those that did wouldn't reveal such knowledge to anyone, even on pain of death. For death holds no fear to those who think death has no hold over them. The citizens who lived in Upper Yardsell-on-the-Mean gave this machine the grand title of Tonari Lapicora. Those that lived further down the hill, and everyone else for that matter, simply called it the clock. A strange name indeed, when no one knew what time or events this supposed clock was measuring. This Tonari Lapicora comprised of numerous stone parts, cogs, pistons, wheels, screws, and all manner of indescribable shapes. These parts continuously rotated, slid, shifted, and interlocked noisily with each other. For those that had viewed this machine, most became mesmerized and were known to stand, mouths agape, and expressions vacant, for minutes, hours, and even days at this most remarkable contraption. 611 years previously, the first settlers constructed a simple house to protect the clock from the elements, or more importantly, from prying eyes. This house had been nothing more than a tent, a very large leather tarpaulin stretched over a ring of 29 very tall poles. As the years passed, wood replaced leather, and stone replaced wood, and the house was given a new name to reflect its new grandeur. It now bore the title of the Domus. Not content with hiding the clock away in the dark, a very tall and very wide stone wall was raised around the bottom of the hill. A single gate provided the only access through this wall. From here, a winding path snaked up the hill to the stone construction of the Domus, which in turn provided the only entrance to the clock. Not long after, another wall was built. This one was even taller and wider, and was built around the first. It also boasted a gatehouse, complete with massive iron doors, a portcullis, and a moat. It was almost 100 years later, still, when a third and final wall was erected, and as befitting the grand plans and ego of the king at that time, this wall was the largest yet. In addition to a larger gatehouse, larger portcullis, more massive doors, and a deeper moat, it boasted a dozen towers, complete with ramparts, counterforts, machicolations, and even platforms for catapults. Despite all these enhancements and expansions, never in the 600 years of Yardsell-on-the-Mean's existence had the clock ever been attacked, threatened, or even so much as suffered at the tail end of a careless bird. 5 elderly scholars, each clutching scrolls and books on mathematics, architecture, and divination, stood and stared at the clock with the familiar gawping expression that had inspired in all its visitors. Their forefathers before them, over 600 years ago, had also stood in the same spot with the same look of wonder and puzzlement. And yet, despite the constant attention, one massive stone house, 3 walls, and 6 centuries later, only one creature had found a practical use of the Turnura Lapicora, and it was nestled upon a cog within a housing, happily asleep and rotating within the core of the machinery. 2 soldiers clad in the blackened steel breastplates of the city's guard, and sporting tabards showing a black eye upon a green hill against a white background, stood sentry next to the huge stone door that led into the clock's prison. Both wore full-face helmets and carried spears and large kite-shaped shields. The shields bore the same design as their tabards. The taller of the 2 turned and looked at his companion.
"It is time,"
he declared. His visor gave his words a slight echo. The companion, shorter by a head, nodded and pushed open the vast stone door that led through to the clock. One of the 5 scholars turned and faced the awaiting guard, his daydream broken by the clink-clank of the guard's steel shoes. He turned to his 4 companions and cleared his throat. Once, twice, coughed, coughed louder, stamped his feet, and then finally cried out aloud. This eventually gained the attention of his peers, and now finally awoken from their stupor, his companions turned towards him, shook their heads to clear their bewilderment, and shuffled out towards the exit. A gust of wind swirled through the domes as the last of the scholars left. It sent this scholar's loose papers spiralling up away from his outstretched arms. Within a few seconds, his 4 companions and the 2 guards had all joined in the fretful task of trying to catch and collect all the scattered papers. No one noticed the single sheet hurtle back through the open door. This solitary sheet of parchment pitched and dipped towards the clock, and then towards its largest cog. This cog was as wide as a house, and tilted at a seemingly impossible angle. The sheet skipped off its surface once, then twice, before coming to a temporary rest. As the cog continued to turn, the sheet of paper now found itself sliding and slipping around other parts of the clock. Moments later, it was chewed up by other cogs, pounded by pistons, and reduced to countless scraps and tatters. Most of the scraps found their way to the floor. The rest were carried through the machinery, through several cycles, being gradually mashed to a pulp. One particular scrap took a fortuitous route, avoiding being shredded, pounded, and minced. As it toppled and tumbled towards the clock's core, it eventually came to a rest with a nudge against the back of a cockroach. This cockroach was as big as a plum, though considerably flatter, and the colour of a chestnut. The instrument of fate stirred. Born and bred from generations of unsquashed cockroaches, it knew both where to scuttle and where not to tarry within the clock. Now rudely awakened and peckish, scratched a leg across its antenna, shook out its wings, and took to the air. Setting a meandering course, it avoided spinning wheels, grinding cogs, and stamping pistons as it buzzed towards the open portal and out to the sprawling city below. Through the combined efforts of the 5 scholars and the 2 guards, all the papers that remained in the vicinity of the exit had been gathered. A stray few had found freedom, flip-flapping in the blustery wind and floating off down the hill. Seeing that the commotion had been brought to an end, the shorter of the 2 guards moved to the door and started to push it shut. The roach, sensing his escape route narrowing by the second, buzzed the louder and quicker, and hurtled through the crack at top speed, striking one guard firmly on the forehead with an audible dink. The guard stumbled back and grunted with surprise. His companion, the taller of the 2, was handing the last of the recovered scrolls back to the red-faced scholar. The scholar scowled as he put his finger through a hole in the paper that the guard's spear had made, This guard, with his visor currently raised, smiled insincerely in mock apology. The cockcrow buzzed onwards. Drawn by the smell of something sweet in the air, the roach flew down the hill, meeting a chain of robe-wearing pilgrims crawling up it. The pilgrims, a brotherhood of monks from some distant land, came armed with prayer sticks and smoking censers. Now a cockroach is not gifted with the best of eyesight, so by the time it had detected an absence of anything edible and the presence of something harmful, it had already buzzed in their midst, bouncing off a pair of censers and numerous bodies. Some of the pilgrims temporarily abandoned their task of diligently rapping their neighbours' heads with their prayer sticks, trying instead to swat the tiny assailant away. But the roach veered and swayed and made good its escape, leaving the pilgrims flapping and uttering nonsense about omens in its wake. On it flew.
Chapter 7: The Witch's Sight.
The vermin will play out its part again, before and after. Now see the pond, skater, ignorant of anything above and below. Look to your own mind, ignorant of anything before and after.
Afternoon reluctantly dragged into early evening. Tallow watched the shadow of the pencil that he'd wedged into his inkwell gradually lengthen and move across the blank sheet of paper in front of him. When Master Balatro finally called the day's session to an end with a wave of his burnt and discoloured hand, the trio of young apprentices leapt from their seats, tucked their books and papers under their arms, and scampered out of the door and down the stairwell to awaiting homes and dormitories. Master Balatro started humming a ditty, as he always did, and wiped down the board with his sleeve. He always did this as well. Tallow tidied his papers and books, and resigned himself to the usual grappling match with his unforgiving desk. Many moments passed, moments of grunting, tilting, jarring and jolting, before he finally bettered his adversary, and staggered away, bruised and battered. Master Balatro was still pottering around, holding chalks up at eye level, and contemplating the paramount issues that arise within the walls of the city's only Academy of Sorcery, whether to reuse them tomorrow. Tallow grunted something resembling a goodbye, ducked his head under the low door frame, and trudged down the stairwell to the ground floor. About 4 or 5 strides along the street from the entrance to the tower, Tallow grinned to himself, exposing teeth as long and uneven as organ pipes, and hurried his walk. A plan was already hatched. He pulled his hood over his head, reached into his robe, and felt for the key. Its touch was pleasantly reassuring. With a skip in his step, he headed towards the poorer parts of the city. Moving first away from the safe, clean area of the academy, Tallow had traversed the district known as Three Trees by locals. Not so long ago, this area had witnessed the hangings of those convicted of murder, counterfeiting, and treason. A drumroll would fill the square, a lever would be pulled, and the stage would open. From 3 very tall, upright wooden beams, the guilty would pitch, drop, and jerk like a string puppet made to dance by a boisterous child. The gallows were gone now, although the horizontal beams remained in almost the same spot. They had been built into the ceiling timbers of a tavern, aptly named the Hangman's Daughter. Every night, the unsavoury patrons that drank here would raise their mugs to the 3 worn grooves in the timbers. Tallow passed before this tavern, just as a toast was being called to those that had tasted the rope. This was soon followed by jeering, cheering, and loud raucous laughter. Head down, Tallow neither noticed nor cared. Crossing a boundary only the locals could pinpoint, he strode into the district called Last Hold, where the cramped, hastily built wooden buildings, characteristic of this part of the city, became a warren. Parts of the prison that had once stood here still remained, a wall here, a building there, all muddled amongst the rickety, ramshackle houses that sprawled throughout the area. As he took a left into an alley, a group of 3 men emerged from the darkness and moved deliberately into Tallow's path. Head still down, his face hidden by the gloom of his hood, he stopped and swished his robe, exposing the hexagram motif embroidered into the folds beneath. The first man gasped, cursed, and backpedaled into his 2 companions. Like wheat before a scythe, the men parted, making a sign of the protective hammer. This sign belonged to the deity Aralupus, a deity whose Templars would travel far and wide with strong words and stronger arms and vanquish all those that dabble in the black arts. Tallow strode past, allowing a smile to pass across his hidden face. He muttered to himself. The next district was easily Tallow's least favourite of this or in any city. It was known as Squealers, and it contained most of the city's numerous slaughterhouses. He held his sleeve tightly over his mouth and nose in an attempt to block the stench of manure and blood that saturated the air. But after a minute or so of breathing shallowly, he stumbled on the grime and sludge that covered the street like melted wax, inhaled sharply, gagged, and choked. Several thin ragamuffins broke their play and watched as the tall, robed figure, leaning against a wall, contributed to the filth in the street with the contents of his stomach. Tallow soon noticed them staring. He cursed aloud and snarled at the nearest child, her clothing and skin the colour of the street. She dropped the straw dolly she was carrying and darted away with the others, their bare feet spraying up mud and blood from the filth that lay underfoot. Tallow took a rose-scented handkerchief from his robe, wiped his mouth, and stumbled on, kicking the dolly aside. 2 more city districts later, and his mood started to lighten, and by the time he eventually reached his destination, a small market in the district of Crow's Call, the faint trace of a smile lingered on his lips. He waited on the outskirts of the market, raised his hood very slightly, and peered out at the few remaining hawkers and stall owners still in the square. With both daylight and the opportunity for sales fading fast, the calls from the market were fast losing their enthusiasm and were quickly sinking to desperation. Abandoning their pitches, sellers now followed potential buyers like ducklings behind their mothers. Urchins, children born of the street, moved in looking for an opportunity to snatch something, anything, from the unmanned stalls. Tallow remained on the fringe of the market square, scanning for the object of his search, a flower seller. And through milling buyers, pestering stall owners, and darting urchins, he spotted her. She stood before the vast, dark, and foreboding carved oak doors of the grand, many-pillared building that, in a previous life, had been the magistrate's court. He grinned and pictured the magistrates in their long black coats, faces pressed against the windows, leering down disapprovingly at the criminals peddling their illegal wares under their very noses. But now, only the faces of children pressed against the glass. Children forced into working large and dangerous machines for a successful cloth merchant. Occasionally bosses could be seen walking past, swishing canes and sending the children scampering away from the windows and back to their bone-breaking looms. Tallow's daydreaming was broken by the emergence of a short, round-shouldered fellow with enormous sideburns and a shirt that looked to have been dragged through a gutter and back again, and once more just for fun.
Pigs' trotters, tails or melt, my lord?
the fellow half asked, half pleaded. Tallow looked down at the crate of various pig body parts in disgust and waved the butcher aside. The fellow hesitated for a second before moving away, his eye drawn by either the white of Tallow's hand, the markings on his robe, or both. Tallow cared not, and flicked his gaze back to where the flower seller had been standing. She was gone. Her bright green stockings and a cheap red dress, all puffed up with layers of frayed lace, were nowhere to be seen. Tallow cursed, and his nostrils flared. The smell of the poor end of the city was beginning to irritate him. He whirled about face, eager to be back in his clean, pleasant room. And there she was, stood barely a yard in front of him. He yelped and threw up his arms in surprise.
Damn you, Rosa!
Tallow hissed through his buck teeth. A smile might have crossed her lips, but had left as quickly as it came, if it came at all. Tallow regained his composure, straightened his robes, and hid his hands back in his long sleeves. Rosa continued to stare, unmoving at Tallow's face. Tallow raised an eyebrow, jutted his head forward, and stared back. After their gazes had remained locked for a few seconds, Tallow blinked and muttered a tad timidly,
Careful, someone doesn't see us.
Rosa let a smile linger this time. Tallow sucked his teeth and looked about nervously for eavesdroppers. He then noticed that the fog that always appeared nightly in the poorer areas of the city was starting to materialize. This was a fog of sweat, steam and tears, and smelt of decay and blood. The fog, Tallow noticed, seemed particularly thick around Rosa and himself. In fact, great swirls were subtly being drawn from the surrounding air to form a rotating ring about them, a ring so dense that neither could he see out, nor could anyone see in. Rosa casually reached into his hidden pocket and pulled out the key. She moved the key between her fingers, never taking her eyes from Tallow's. She then clenched the key in one hand and held the other, palm up, in front of Tallow. He deftly retrieved 2 silver coins from a pouch beneath his robe and placed them in her hand.
One will do.
She said tartly. Tallow continued to press both into her palm.
So be it.
She whispered. She closed her fingers around the coins and dropped her basket to the floor. Her flowers scattered amongst the puddles, plumstones, cherry stems, and boiled knuckles, the usual litter found on the floor of this market at the close of the day's business. She crouched as if to pick them up. Tallow did likewise and held his silence. A moment later, a chill emerged, causing his breath to appear as wisp-like spectres in the gloom. Even the nearby conversations and padding of footsteps became muffled and distant as the witch worked her magic. From her mouth came a chant of whispers, the words guttural and alien. With the key clutched in one hand, she waved her other over a puddle barely the size of a saucer. An image appeared on its surface. Tallow held his breath, leant forward, and focused on the image. He could make out Master Belatro and another figure, a short, rounded man. He was so rounded, in fact, that he was almost a ball. This stranger wore a mustard-coloured waistcoat and had a hood drawn over his head. This obscured most of his face. Behind the two of them, Tallow discerned the familiar rounded walls and counter of the ground floor of the Sorcery Academy. The portly stranger pulled his hood up away from his face, a face as round as a plate. He had dabbed rouge on his cheeks, applied a shadow under his first chin, hoping to disguise his other 3, and drawn what looked like a small red butterfly on his lips. He looked ridiculous. He began to speak, yet the voice came not from the image on the puddle. It came from Rosa.
I risk too much coming here.
The voice was rather whiny and stuffy. Rosa's voice then changed to that of Master Belatro's.
Bother yourself not. No, many people, just from curiosity, visit here. I have quite a collection.
Well, let's make this as quick as we can.
The stuffy voice cut in. The stout fellow reached down to his side and lifted up a case that may have contained a tall hat or a deep vase. This he handed to Belatro, using what seemed an unnecessary amount of care. Belatro giggled. kissed the case, and then ran his tongue across his lips with a saurian flicker of greedy delight. Tallow was startled by this most unusual reaction from his doddery old master. He leant closer and strained to see if he could discern any more detail about the identity of this mysterious package, but the image was too small, and it started to flicker and shimmer. He scowled and snapped his head up to look at Rosa. His expression quickly softened from agitation to concern when he saw that her face was etched with effort and her breathing short and sharp. She flashed Tallow a quick smile of reassurance and gestured with her eyes for him to look back at the image. The scene had moved on. Tallow could now see the man leaving the academy and Bellatrix climbing the stairwell, past the first story, the classroom, and up again into his living quarters. The old master lit a lantern and set the tall case on a table. Leaning forward, and with a hint of something mischievous and altogether sinister in his expression, he wiggled his fingers and unlatched the lid. He first peered down into the case, and from Rosa's throat came a giggle. His giggle. Tallow had never heard his sorcerer mastery giggle. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like a giggle that should have come from a stuffy, bumbling old dodderer. But it did. Bellatrix then took a step back, blew on his fingers, waited a moment, then carefully, slowly, he reached forward and eased something up and out of the case. It was a vase. No, more like a jar. Once he had set this down on the table next to the case, he stepped back once more. Another moment passed before he leaned forward and tapped the jar with a finger. Nothing happened. The scene shimmered again. Tallow kept his head lowered, but raised his eyes to look at Rosa. As always, he saw that she wore a fine white powder on her face, but it did very little to remove the lines of hardship that marred her otherwise pretty looks. Her hair was mostly black, with a trace of silver at the temples. To Tallow she looked like a china doll, petite and vulnerable, with large, unblinking eyes that merely reflected life around her, rather than provide a window to her soul. Tallow's musing was then abruptly broken by the sound of Bellatrix's voice coming from Rosa's mouth once more.
Pom, 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 malachite and azurite, pom, 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 peridot and hematite.
The puddle now showed Bellatrix waving his silver key around in time with his ditty. In his other hand he held a lantern, and under the arm, the case. He was taking the stairwell up to the top story of the tower. All the while, Rosa continued to sing in his voice.
Moonstone and opal, emerald and spinel.
The stairwell stopped at the foot of a steel door. The steel door. This was apparently enchanted to resist all attempts at entry, as were the walls, ceiling, and floor of the ultimate and top story of the tower. Tallow recalled the demise of Lucy Pinder. The master had a passion for limericks.
Heed the tale of little Lucy Pinder. In less than a second burned to a cinder. Touch the door. She do that no more. Now she's nothing more than tinder.
Then there was Tommy Trout.
Heed the tale of silly Tommy Trout. He managed just to whimper, not even a shout. Touch the door, he'd do that no more. He was promptly turned inside out.
Tallow recalled the graphic details Master Bellatrix delved into regarding Tommy's fate and his exposed innards. And then there was Moribund Caltrop. He tried a spell of opening on the door, and as a result, the poor boy Caltrop, well, this is what the master had sang with a hint of menace and a touch of glee.
Heed the tale of Moribund Caltrop. Tried a spell and couldn't stop. When his brain had sizzled, smoke and fizzled, and only ceased when his eyes went pop.
Tallow was unconvinced of the truth of these tales of woe. The younger students were convinced. They had visibly recoiled at the master's lurid description, and shared a pallor with the green of the master's chalks. Bellatrix briefly ceased his singing, dropped the key in a pocket, and with his spare hand rummaged around in his robe for something else. This something he held clenched in his palm. Tallow judged that this something must be a key of sorts, the only means to open the enchanted door. Maybe there was truth in the tales. just maybe. Holding the something aloft, the master grinned and popped it into his mouth. It was nothing more than a toffee humbug, the master's favourite. Tallow scowled, angry at himself for believing, albeit briefly, in Belatro's silly rhymes. His mouth now full, the master quickly muttered some words. Tallow turned his head to Rosa, straining to hear them, but all he heard was the master's usual mumbling. He did notice, however, that Rosa's voice could be heard alongside the master's, but hers was barely a whisper. Now this begged the question of just how Rosa could speak with two voices at the same time. Tallow put the question to the back of his mind and peered back to the scene on the puddle. The master peered suspiciously over his shoulder, waved his hand before the door, and announced,
Open sesame.
He chuckled. The door swung open. Belatro sucked noisily on his humbug and stepped in. Tallow screwed up his face in disbelief. He then frowned. He reasoned that there must be more to opening the door than this childish cantrip. He parked this oddity also in the back of his mind, and went down closer to the puddle, his face now just inches away. Within this mysterious top story he could see rods, wands, staves, helmets, a breastplate supported by a frame, and several cloaks on a coat stand. And all about the walls were tapestries. Belatro put his lantern and the case on a low wooden table. On this table was a small steel chest. He picked up the chest and continued his song whilst chewing and slurping.
Bloodstone red and a pearl of snowy white, the darkest green of Alexandria.
Belatro turned the chest upside down, ran his hands over its base, smiled and retrieved the silver key from his pocket. Tallow ahed in anticipation. The master inserted the key in a lock on the underside of the chest and carefully turned it before taking the key out and replacing the chest back on the table. He flicked the lid open. Tallow started to grin. The mystery of the silver key would soon be revealed. The old sorcery tutor started to take many multicoloured, precious-looking stones as small as pebbles from the inside of the chest. He held them in turn before his face, spitting on each and then wiping it on the sleeves of his robe. Tallow huffed and blew out a raspberry. This was an anticlimax. He wanted to see something marvellous and exciting. Failing that, something sinister. Failing that, something at least moderately interesting. Instead, all he witnessed was his old nemesis handling nothing more than a jar, a boring, inconsequential jar, and then playing with a handful of agates. He moved his focus away from Belatro, still singing and admiring his precious stones, to that of the tapestries on the wall behind. Tallow thought,
Why would the master hang tapestries in his room?
It was scruffy. In fact, the master redefined scruffy. His purple robe was purple no longer. It was faded, burnt, and blotchy with chalk. His beard was unkempt, and like the rest of him, covered in chalk. Even his face and hands looked to have been deprived of soap for a decade or two. So Tallow continued to reason.
And why would the master cover the room in tapestries that no one would see?
Tallow parked this with the other two unanswered questions for rumination later. He turned his full attention back to the scene. The tapestry immediately past Belatro's left shoulder depicted a windmill, the glory of its bright colours now dulled with age. Tallow turned and twisted his head over the puddle, trying to catch a glimpse of any of the others. Belatro's voice then started to drift off, and the image began to fade. Tallow grunted in surprise and jerked his head up to look at Rosa. She met his eye, frowned, waved her hand over the puddle, and resumed the spell. Tallow noticed again that when she wasn't speaking with another's voice, she was chanting strange words just under her breath. Belatro was gone. The lantern remained on the table. The chest was now closed. The silver key was lying next to it. The jar was also gone. Tallow looked up at Rosa, somewhat surprised. She simply used her eyes once again to direct his gaze back to the image, maintaining her strange chant as she did so. The fog continued to orbit the pair, keeping their activities guarded. Nothing was happening. Nothing had moved. Nothing was moving save the lazy flicker of the lantern. Tallow kept watching. Shortly afterwards, the sound of Rosa's chant gave way to the voice of Belatro.
Purple is its golden green, pale is blue aquamarine.
Tallow peered intensely at the image, but the room was still unoccupied. Then, as suddenly as he had disappeared, Belatro was there once more. Footsteps approached the pair. Rosa fell silent. the image faded and she started to gather her fallen flowers. Tallow chewed on his lower lip, mulling over the images he had just witnessed. He slowly stood up from his kneeling position. One of his knees clicked in protest. Rosa remained in a crouch, keeping her head bowed and her face hidden, waiting for the sound of the footsteps to fade away. Tallow mumbled something that he knew Rosa couldn't hear before spinning about face and striding away. At the edge of the market square he stopped, looked over his shoulder, and saw her through the thinning fog, patting down her threadbare, tatty red dress. He sighed and returned back to his home, taking a longer route to avoid the horrors of Squealers. Tallow was first into the classroom the following morning. As he strolled in, he looked down at the floor under the blackboard, grinning as he saw the usual mixture of coloured mounds of chalk stubs and powder. With sleight of hand worthy of a sideshow conjurer, the silver key found itself from his robe to his palm and down his robe to land atop his soft leather boot. With a petulant flick of his ankle, the key skidded across the floor into the stubs. As it came to rest, the only evidence of his subterfuge was a puff of chalk powder.